The noon sun on Guam in August 1945 bleached everything to the color of bone. Coral dust hung in the still air like the haze from an old artillery barrage, settling on the barbed wire fence that separated Private First Class Sam DeLuca from the men he had been trained to kill. His M1 Garand felt warm against his palm, the walnut stock absorbing the tropical heat. He had stood guard over prisoners before, but never a crowd like this. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, their khaki uniforms faded to the color of dry grass, their faces unreadable behind the wire. From a canvas-topped truck, sailors unloaded wooden crates stenciled in black, Special Services, U.S. The lids came off with the scrape of crowbars. Inside lay neat rows of Louisville slugger bats, their ash barrels pale as driftwood, leather gloves, balls still smelling of fresh hide and rubber, spilled across the dusty ground. DeLuca blinked, thinking at first it must be a mix-up in supply. Baseball gear, not rations or medical kits. A Navy chief with a clipboard barked orders, and Seabees set to work with quick, economical motions. Chalk lines appeared on the crushed coral, the field sketched into existence, as if a magician were drawing geometry in the air. DeLuca caught the faint hiss of a Coca-Cola bottle cap being pried loose nearby, the sweet scent of syrup briefly overtaking the briny breeze from Ypres Harbor. Beyond the wire, the prisoners shifted uneasily. These men had survived the brutal Banzai charges on Saipan and Tinian. Some still bore the bandaged stumps of bayonet wounds. They had been taught through the Senjin-kun of 1941 that surrender meant shame worse than death. American propaganda, they had been told, hid a nation of savages who would torture captives. Yet here were their captors marking a diamond, preparing a pastime. The sun hammered down and a lone gull wheeled overhead, its cry slicing through the low murmur of voices. A guard tower's Browning M1919 machine gun, its steel receiver capable of spitting 400 rounds a minute, glinted like a silent reminder of the war not yet formally ended. DeLuca shifted the 8-round clip in his Garand and wondered if anyone else felt the same disorientation he did. Then came the sharp, clean crack of the first bat-striking ball. It sounded, to DeLuca's war-tuned ears, uncannily like the metallic ping of a spent clip ejecting from his rifle, a sound of endings. Japanese heads turned as one, eyes narrowing not in fear but in startled recognition of something entirely unexpected. The game was on, and with it began a quiet unraveling of everything they had been taught to believe about the enemy. 4 years earlier, long before DeLuca's watch on Guam, the story had begun in the oil-streaked waters off Oahu. Dawn of 8th December 1941 found Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki clinging to the shattered hull of his Type A midget submarine. The night before, he and Petty Officer Kiyoshi Inagaki had slipped beneath the surf, part of a 5-boat force ordered to penetrate Pearl Harbor's defenses. Their 46-ton craft, barely 78 feet long, carrying 2 18-inch torpedoes, had run aground after repeated depth charge attacks. Inagaki's body lay somewhere in the black water. Sakamaki alone reached shore, exhausted and half-conscious, to be captured by startled U.S. soldiers near Bellows Field. For the young officer, the shame was instant and total. The Senjin-kun, issued only months before, thundered in his memory, never lived to experience shame as a prisoner. Capture was a stain no act of later valor could cleanse. He expected execution. Instead, American medics bound his wounds and offered water. Weeks later, Sakamaki was on a troop train crossing the American heartland, the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels carrying him farther from the Pacific than he had thought possible. Outside, the December landscape of the upper Midwest rolled by, frozen rivers, smoke curling from farmhouse chimneys. He would have watched in silence, the white fields mocking his failure. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, awaited him. In winter 1942, its barbed wire compound stood amid snow-drifted ridges, the thermometer plunging well below freezing. By war's end, the camp would hold some 2,700 Japanese prisoners, along with Koreans and thousands of Germans. But Sakamaki was the first. Guards stamped their boots against the cold, M1 Garands slung across heavy coats. The 8-round clips of those rifles would later become the unmistakable ping of Allied firepower from Normandy to the Philippines. The young officer endured questioning by the Military Intelligence Service, his silence broken only by the occasional interpreter's patient query. He could not reconcile the treatment he received, medical care, clean clothing, hot meals, with the Imperial Navy's portrayal of Americans as barbarians. Each day the paradox grew. The enemy's industrial democracy, so vast it could clothe and feed its captives, seemed at once alien and irresistible. When he finally glimpsed the first game of baseball on the frozen parade ground, a few bored guards batting a ball across packed snow, Sakamaki felt the first fissure in the iron code that bound him. He would not speak of it for years, but in that small, strange spectacle lay the seed of a realization that would one day echo across all the camps. The enemy's greatest strength was not merely its weapons, but the confident abundance that made mercy possible. The requisition sheet felt almost trivial in Lieutenant Helen Carter's gloved hands as she waited in the Milwaukee Quartermaster Depot's supply office in the spring of 1942. Outside, the city hummed with the low thunder of wartime industry, rail cars clanking, foundry whistles piercing the gray morning. Inside, a pot of stale coffee steamed beside a battered Remington typewriter, while a clerk tallied figures that would soon circle the globe. Carter scanned the list again: baseball bats, leather gloves, boxes of chalk, and syrup concentrate for Coca-Cola. Nothing on the page hinted at the battles raging from the Coral Sea to Burma, yet every item carried the quiet authority of the War Department seal. Special Services had charged her with provisioning recreation for both American soldiers and enemy prisoners. The Geneva Convention of 1929, Article 17, she knew by heart, required intellectual diversions and sports for prisoners of war. But to Carter, the real marvel was how easily the American machine made it happen. The same supply lines feeding Patton's tanks and Nimitz's carriers could, without strain, deliver a crate of Louisville sluggers to a distant island or a stockade in Wisconsin. She walked the depot floor where warehouses stretched like aircraft hangars, their steel rafters dripping with condensation. Forklifts groaned under pallets of olive-drab crates, each stenciled U.S. Army. Somewhere on those lines rolled the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the Deuce and a Half, that would carry everything from ammunition to baseball gear. Powered by a 91-horsepower engine and 6-wheel drive, more than 500,000 of these rugged workhorses would eventually crisscross 2 oceans of war. Carter paused as a railcar door slid open with a metallic shriek. Inside, rows of Coca-Cola syrup drums gleamed under the depot lights. The company had already begun erecting bottling plants near American bases overseas, 64 by war's end, so that GIs could drink an ice-cold Coke from Casablanca to Guadalcanal. She thought of the enemy's soldiers who believed America soft and decadent. What would they make of a nation so confident it could refrigerate a soda in the middle of a global conflict? She signed the requisition, her fountain pen scratching across government paper. The ink dried as slowly as the coffee cooled. Beyond the depot's brick walls, foundries poured steel for Liberty ships and aircraft factories inched toward the impossible statistic. 96,000 American planes produced in 1944 alone, more than Japan would build in the entire war. Carter slipped the form into the clerk's outbox, aware that these seemingly ordinary supplies would soon travel the same convoys as bombs and rifles. When she stepped into the raw spring air, the clamor of Milwaukee's war boom swelled around her like the opening bars of a march. Somewhere down the line, on a coral atoll or a snowy Wisconsin field, those bats and bottles would become a weapon of another sort, a quiet demonstration of a democracy's inexhaustible strength. By the winter of 1943, the parade ground at Camp McCoy lay beneath a sky the color of pewter, the Wisconsin wind slicing across the open fields with a knife-edge chill. Frost glazed the barbed wire and turned every breath to steam. Japanese prisoners, wrapped in heavy coats issued by the U.S. Army, trudged toward the flattened expanse where a game was about to begin. Snow squeaked under their boots, a sound almost musical in the frozen stillness. Private First Class. Sam DeLuca stamped his feet for warmth and checked the clip in his M1 Garand. The rifle's 8 rounds of .30-06 ammunition sat ready, the distinctive metallic ping of its ejecting clip a sound he had come to associate with victory from the Solomons to Sicily. Above him, the Browning M1919 in the guard tower crouched like a steel sentinel, capable of firing 400 to 600 rounds a minute, though tonight it seemed as distant as the moon. A pair of Army Special Services men, parkas dusted with snow, dragged a crate of baseballs onto the field. They were bright white against the gray world, seams stitched tight and smelling faintly of fresh hide. A bag of bats followed, their pale ash barrels gleaming like icicles. The prisoners hesitated at first, their discipline colliding with curiosity. The Senjin-kun Code had warned them that capture was worse than death, that Americans were cruel barbarians. Yet here were guards inviting them to play the quintessential American game. One by one, the men shed their gloves and reached for the bats. The first swing cracked like a rifle shot in the cold air, echoing off the driftless hills. DeLuca felt the vibration of that sound deep in his chest, as though the land itself acknowledged the paradox. Men who had fought to the last on Saipan now running bases on American soil. Snowflakes began to drift again, softening the edges of the wire. From the mess hall chimney, a thin ribbon of wood smoke curled upward, carrying the smell of coffee and roasted meat. Somewhere a truck engine coughed to life, a GMC CCKW, its 91 horsepower motor growling against the cold, ready to haul rations or perhaps more baseball gear. DeLuca watched a Japanese batter drive a ball into the brittle twilight, a clean line over the frozen outfield. The fielders scrambled, their breath pluming like steam from locomotives. For a moment the war felt impossibly far away, yet the silent towers and the glint of machine gun steel reminded all that it was not. As the inning ended, DeLuca caught himself smiling. The crack of the bat had become a bridge between enemies, and in the simple geometry of chalked baselines lay a revelation more powerful than any dispatch from Washington. America could afford mercy because its strength was beyond question. July 1944 burned like a furnace on the island of Saipan. The jungle steamed under a sun so fierce it baked the coral sand to a blinding white. Yoshio Tanaka crawled from the mouth of a cave, his uniform tattered and caked with soot from the previous night's bombardment. Behind him, the air still reeked of cordite and the acrid stench of burned flesh. For days he had heard the unrelenting thunder of American naval guns, 16-inch rifles from battleships that could hurl a 2,700-pound shell over 20 miles, and the guttural whine of carrier aircraft. The final banzai charge had dissolved in a chaos of screams and bayonet thrusts. Now only the cries of the wounded echoed in the ravines. Tanaka had been taught since childhood that surrender meant eternal disgrace. The Senjin-kun of 8 January 1941 was etched in his memory. Never lived to experience shame as a prisoner. Yet when he stumbled into the clearing, gaunt and half-starved, the Marines did not raise their rifles. They offered water from battered canteens, the metallic tang of lukewarm GY issue washing the dust from his throat. Nearby, corpsmen bound the wounds of friend and foe alike. Of the roughly 29,000 Japanese troops on Saipan, nearly all were dead. Barely 3,400 had surrendered. American losses, about 3,100 killed, were heavy by U.S. standards, but inconceivable given the slaughter among Tanaka's comrades. His journey to the rear took him past an astonishing machinery of war. GMC-CKW deuce-and-a-half trucks groaned under mountains of ammunition. Navy construction battalions, Seabees, raised prefabricated Quonset huts in hours. On the beach, LSTS, landing ship, tank, disgorged jeeps and Sherman tanks as easily as a boy scattering marbles. The sheer abundance struck him harder than any shell. He had been told the Americans were decadent and weak. Instead, he saw a nation so rich in steel and fuel that it built highways of supply across the Pacific. Weeks later, when Tanaka reached the prisoner stockade on Guam, he encountered a sight that unsettled him more than the naval guns: baseball. POWs, some barely recovered from their wounds, played under the watchful eyes of guards. The crack of a Louisville slugger carried across the compound, its sound uncannily like the ping of an M1 Garand clip ejecting. From a nearby PX tent came the hiss of a Coca-Cola bottle being opened. The drink's sweet aroma drifted on the humid breeze. 64 such bottling plants, he would later learn, had been established overseas, enough to chill a soda even in the tropics of war. Tanaka watched in silence, his world-view tilting. Here was an enemy whose mercy was matched only by its capacity for plenty. The Empire had promised him honor in death. The Americans offered a game, a drink, and the quiet implication that they could afford generosity because victory was already certain. By late summer 1945, the Guam stockade pulsed with the languid rhythm of the tropics. Afternoon heat shimmered off the coral dust, and the scent of salt and coconut oil hung heavy in the air. POWs gathered again at the baseball diamond, their khaki uniforms bleached almost white by the relentless sun. Yoshio Tanaka squinted toward the outfield, where a Seabee had just chalked the baselines with a careless abundance that made his heart lurch. The Americans drew lines as if chalk were infinite, each mark a silent taunt to a nation where even rice now came by ration card. Stacks of baseballs lay in an open crate, their leather unscuffed. Bats rested in neat rows like rifles on parade. Tanaka counted more equipment than his entire company had possessed in functioning rifles when Saipan fell. He had heard rumors, whispered by interpreters or gleaned from tattered newspapers, that the United States had produced an impossible 296,000 military aircraft since 1940, with 96,000 rolling off the lines in 1944 alone. That single year's output exceeded what Japan's factories had built in the entire war. Guards lounged by the fence, the metallic ping of M1 Garand clips punctuating the easy banter as shifts changed. A Browning M 1919 in the tower glinted in the sun, capable of 400 to 600 rounds a minute, yet its menace seemed almost ornamental beside the cheerful chaos of the ball game. A soldier passed Tanaka a bottle of Coca-Cola. The glass sweated in the heat. Inside, bubbles hissed like tiny artillery shells. He remembered the stories of American cruelty, the warnings that capture meant certain torture. Instead, he tasted syrup and ice, the sweetness shocking against his parched throat. Lieutenant Helen Carter watched from the shade of a Quonset hut, clipboard in hand. Months earlier, she had signed the requisitions that made this moment possible. Louisville sluggers shipped with the same precision as artillery shells, Coca-Cola syrup traveling the same convoy routes as aviation fuel. More than 2.4 million Army trucks, including over 812,000 of the rugged CCKW 2.5-tonners, had carried such cargo across 2 oceans. The statistics were so vast they seemed like fiction, but the evidence lay scattered across the diamond in leather and wood. For Tanaka, the realization cut deeper than any wound. America's strength was not merely its weapons or the 16-inch naval rifles that had shattered Saipan. It was this: the confidence to waste, to lavish resources on prisoners' games while still outproducing the Axis by orders of magnitude. The crack of the bat and the fizz of a Coke were not diversions. They were a declaration that the war's outcome had been decided long before he left his cave. The Guam afternoon pressed down like a warm, wet blanket as the game unfolded. The coral dust, kicked into the air by sliding runners, glowed in shafts of late sunlight. From the guard tower came the occasional metallic ping as an M1 Garand's 8-round clip sprang free, routine shift changes marked by the sound that had become the heartbeat of American firepower. Below, the prisoners played with growing confidence, their voices rising in laughter that only weeks earlier would have seemed inconceivable. Among the spectators stood Lieutenant Helen Carter, the clipboard that had once carried requisitions now filled with notes from interpreters. What had begun as simple recreation had become, almost without design, an opportunity for quiet intelligence work. Military Intelligence Service linguists lingered near the backstop, striking up casual conversations between innings. A question about a good batting stance slid naturally into an inquiry about troop movements or supply lines. It was not coercion, but curiosity that loosened tongues. Private First Class Sam DeLuca had seen interrogation rooms, the hard lights and sharper questions, but this was something subtler. He watched as a translator, pretending to admire a prisoner's swing, jotted a few characters in a notebook, a name, a unit designation, perhaps even the location of a hidden munitions dump, bits of information that, pieced together, might guide the next Pacific offensive. Above them, the Browning M1919 machine gun rested in its cradle, a silent reminder that this game existed under the shadow of war. Yet the prisoners seemed almost to forget. The crack of a bat and the thud of a ball into leather glove blurred the lines between captor and captive. The Geneva Convention had mandated recreation for POWs. America's industrial might had turned that requirement into a strategic advantage. The scale of that might was never far from Carter's mind. Over 812,000 of the rugged GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks had already rolled from Detroit's assembly lines, hauling everything from artillery shells to crates of baseballs. The same factories that produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944 could, without strain, supply a prisoner camp with chalk and leather. It was abundance as strategy. When a nation could spare such luxuries, it revealed a depth of power no enemy could match. As the game reached its final innings, DeLuca noticed the prisoners lingering near the translators, volunteering stories of distant garrisons and forgotten supply caches. The sun dropped lower, turning the coral dust to molten gold. Carter closed her clipboard with a quiet snap, the notes inside a testament to intelligence gathered not by force, but by the gentle rhythm of a pastime. When the final out was called, a cheer went up. Guards and prisoners alike momentarily united in the simple drama of sport. In that mingling of voices lay a subtle victory, the American capacity to win not only battles but minds, using nothing more lethal than a bat and a well-thrown ball. Far from the coral diamonds of Guam, the beating heart of American power thundered in the industrial Midwest. In 1944, the night sky over Detroit glowed orange from the blast furnaces of River Rouge, while the air in Wichita vibrated with the hammering of B-29 assembly lines. What a single year produced here, 96,000 military aircraft, outstripped Japan's total wartime output. The statistics seemed almost impossible. In 12 months, America built more planes than the Empire of Japan could in the entire conflict. Women in bandanas riveted aluminum skins onto the broad wings of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, each with a 141-foot wingspan and capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs across the Pacific. Conveyor belts of engines, landing gear, and machine gun turrets moved with a precision that mirrored the choreography of a well-drilled infantry platoon. Liberty ships slid down the ways at a pace of nearly 3 a day, their welded hulls replacing the slower, hand-riveted methods of the past. The same economy that produced the M1 Garand, its 8-round en-bloc clip giving every infantryman a rapid-fire advantage, also found room to ship baseballs to Guam and Wisconsin. More than 2.4 million Army trucks rolled from factories, including over 812,000 of the CCKW Deuce and a Half, the backbone of Allied logistics. Their 91 horsepower engines hauled everything: 16-inch naval shells, aviation gasoline, and crates of Coca-Cola syrup destined for makeshift bottling plants near the front. This was the arsenal of democracy, Franklin Roosevelt's phrase turned tangible reality. Each assembly line was a front in itself, each worker a soldier. The industrial numbers did not simply support the war, they dwarfed the enemy's capacity and made American generosity credible. The sight of baseball games in POW camps was not a trivial distraction, but a visible proof of the economic hurricane that backed the U.S. military. Helen Carter, reviewing reports from Detroit while stationed back in Milwaukee, understood the connection instinctively. The same supply network that fed the front also delivered the quiet symbols of plenty that stunned captured soldiers. Private DeLuca, thousands of miles away on Guam, may never have seen a B-29 under construction, but when he heard the hiss of a Coke bottle or the solid crack of a Louisville Slugger, he was hearing the echo of those factories. As 1944 waned, the glow of American industry illuminated the night from Kansas to New Jersey, a second sun promising the final collapse of the Axis. The power that could launch a superfortress across the Pacific and still spare chalk for a POW diamond was a force no empire of scarcity could hope to withstand. Twilight fell over Camp McCoy on August 14, 1945, bringing with it the faint metallic scent of impending rain and the distant rumble of a Midwestern thunderstorm. Private First Class Sam DeLuca leaned on his M1 Garand, the familiar walnut stock cool against his palm as evening settled over the Wisconsin hills. Beyond the barbed wire, Japanese prisoners of war jogged the bases of the chalked diamond, their breath rising in faint white puffs against the gathering dusk. The crack of a Louisville Slugger rang out, sharp and clean in the humid air, and for a moment the world seemed poised between innings and eternity. Inside the guardhouse, a battered radio sputtered with static. DeLuca caught fragments of an urgent broadcast. Tokyo accepting Allied surrender terms, the war at last drawing to a close. A sergeant leaned in, his ear nearly touching the speaker, while a Morse operator tapped the news down the line. The words reached the compound in ripples. The Emperor himself had ordered Japan to lay down its arms. The prisoners froze mid-play as the announcement was translated. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the chirr of crickets in the tall grass beyond the wire. Yoshio Tanaka felt his chest tighten. He had survived the furnace of Saipan, the indignity of capture, the slow erosion of the Senjin-kun Code. Now, hearing the Emperor's voice carried by distant radio waves, he realized that the war that had consumed his world was over, not in the blaze of a banzai charge, but in a quiet surrender spoken across the Pacific. A guard tower's Browning M1919 caught the last streak of sunset, its steel receiver gleaming like a fading star. The machine gun, capable of hurling 400 rounds a minute, stood silent now, a weapon without a target. DeLuca watched as prisoners dropped their gloves and removed their caps. Some bowed their heads, others looked skyward, eyes reflecting the first flickers of lightning. Lieutenant Helen Carter emerged from the administration hut, her clipboard tucked under one arm. She had signed the requisitions for bats and Coca-Cola months ago, never imagining she would witness the final act of the war on a baseball field. The statistics she carried in her mind, 296,000 American aircraft produced since 1940, more than 2.4 million Army trucks, suddenly felt less like numbers and more like the chorus of an ending. A low cheer began among the guards, a sound of relief more than triumph. Slowly, almost shyly, a few prisoners joined in, their voices tentative at first, then steadier, until the night air hummed with a fragile, shared acknowledgement. The killing was done. Rain began to fall, soft and cold, blurring the chalk lines of the diamond. DeLuca tilted his head back and let the drops wash the coral dust from his face, the taste of victory and mercy mingling on his lips. Weeks later, long after the surrender's first shock had settled into the routines of occupation, American officers began to record the testimonies of their former enemies. In the quiet offices of Camp McCoy and the humid barracks of Guam, Japanese prisoners spoke haltingly of the moments that had unsettled their certainties. They described the first crack of a bat in an American camp, the unexpected offer of a Coca-Cola, the simple fairness of hot meals and medical care. Each memory chipped away at the imperial image of Americans as cruel barbarians. Military Intelligence Service scribes noted how often the prisoners cited baseball as the moment their understanding began to change. The game, familiar yet foreign, embodied something they had not expected: confidence without arrogance, power without cruelty. The Geneva Convention's Article 17 had mandated recreation for POWs, but in practice it had become a quiet weapon of persuasion. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, the first Japanese captured at Pearl Harbor, reflected in his later memoirs on the paradox of his captivity. He had expected torture. Instead, he found the Americans scrupulous in their treatment, even generous. The very abundance of the camp, new bats when old ones splintered, endless baseballs, the sweet hiss of soda poured over ice, told a story of industrial democracy he could not deny. For Helen Carter, reading these reports back in Milwaukee, the statistics took on a human shape. The impossible numbers: 5,777 Liberty ships launched, 18 fleet carriers in service by 1945, aircraft production that in a single year outstripped Japan's entire wartime output, were no longer abstract. They explained how America could clothe, feed, and even entertain its captives while waging war across two oceans. Yoshio Tanaka, now awaiting repatriation, admitted to an interpreter that he would return to a homeland shattered by firebombing and famine. He carried with him the memory of a baseball diamond where enemies had played together, and the realization that America's strength was rooted not just in weapons, but in a culture of plenty. For him, and for many others, the first seeds of post-war reconciliation were planted not in the conference rooms of diplomats, but on those improvised fields of play. When the last trainload of prisoners departed Camp McCoy, DeLuca watched in silence as the cars rattled east. He understood dimly that the true victory was more than military. It was the quiet triumph of a free people whose abundance made mercy not a risk but a declaration of power. On a gray November morning in 1945, the war's paperwork began to settle like autumn leaves across Washington. In a War Department office stacked high with production reports, a historian traced his finger down columns of figures that seemed to defy the limits of arithmetic. They were not merely statistics. They were the measure of a nation's resolve. Nearly 296,000 military aircraft had rolled from American factories between 1940 and 1945. Of those, an impossible 96,000 were produced in the single year of 1944, more than the Empire of Japan managed in the entire war. Shipyards had launched 5,777 Liberty ships, at times sliding nearly 3 down the ways in a single day. 18 fleet carriers prowled the seas by 1945, a steel armada larger than the total tonnage of the Japanese Navy at its pre-war peak. The numbers cascaded like an artillery barrage. Over 2.4 million Army trucks had been accepted into service, including more than 812,000 of the rugged GMC CCKW 2.5-ton Deuce and a Half, their 91 horsepower engines hauling supplies across continents and archipelagos. American factories produced in 1 month more ammunition than Japan could in a year. The nation's gross domestic product nearly doubled from 1939 to 1945, financing not only the weapons of victory but the quiet luxuries: baseball bats, Coca-Cola syrup, motion picture projectors that reached even the prisoner stockades. These figures were more than ledger entries. They explained the scene on Guam and at Camp McCoy: prisoners sipping cold soda while their captors chalked a diamond. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, but only a nation of such abundance could comply so lavishly while still fighting a global war on 2 fronts. For the Japanese who watched Americans play baseball behind barbed wire, the impossible statistics were invisible yet unmistakably present in every spare bat and every crate of unscarred baseballs. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, the first Japanese POW, would later write of the terrible gentleness of his captors, a gentleness made possible by overwhelming power. Yoshio Tanaka, who had survived Saipan's firestorm, carried home memories of a stockade where a game revealed an empire of plenty. For Sam DeLuca, standing guard with his M1 Garand, the rifle whose 8-round clip gave every U.S. soldier a rapid-fire edge, the figures in Washington became flesh and blood, proof that the abundance he witnessed daily was the visible tip of a continental iceberg of production. As the historian closed the final folder, the echo of those factory floors seemed to vibrate through the quiet office like the lingering crack of a bat-on ball. The war had been won not only by courage, but by an industrial democracy whose capacity for creation rendered enemy ambition obsolete. Decades later, long after the camps had emptied and the rusted barbed wire had sagged into the weeds, a new baseball game unfolded beneath a summer sky. On a field outside Tokyo, American veterans and former Japanese prisoners, now elderly men with faces lined by time, gathered for a commemorative match. Children perched on blankets along the foul lines, their laughter mingling with the soft pop of gloves and the thud of a ball on dirt. Sam DeLuca, hair gone white, shook hands with Yoshio Tanaka, whose once gaunt frame had filled out in peacetime. They spoke through an interpreter at first, then found that the language of baseball needed little translation. Tanaka recalled the humid afternoons of 1945 when the hiss of a Coca-Cola bottle and the smell of coral dust had signaled that the war, and the world he knew, was ending. DeLuca remembered the metallic ping of his Garand's clip and the uneasy wonder he'd felt as enemies became ball players. Nearby, a plaque honored Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, the first Japanese captured at Pearl Harbor, who had lived to see his nation rebuild into a democratic ally. His own writings had spoken of the shock of mercy, of the realization that the American strength lay not merely in weapons, but in the confidence to be generous. The numbers that had once seemed impossible now read like prologue to a partnership. Post-war trade between the United States and Japan reached tens of billions of dollars annually. The two nations, once locked in mortal combat, became linchpins of a Pacific alliance that helped secure the longest era of great power peace in modern history. As the game progressed, Helen Carter, long retired from the Army and now a grandmother, sat in the stands and watched a Japanese child swing at a pitch thrown by an American veteran. She thought of the requisition forms she had signed in Milwaukee, of the Liberty ships and B-29s, of the hundreds of thousands of CCKW trucks. The same industrial might that had crushed totalitarian ambition had also made possible this gentle afternoon. When the final out was called, the crowd stood in quiet applause. A baseball arced high against the setting sun, its path a bright parabola of memory and reconciliation. In its flight lay the enduring truth revealed behind the wire in 1945, that American freedom's greatest triumph was not only in the battles won, but in the confidence to turn abundance into mercy and enemies into friends.